We're going to continue our Old Testament study. Tonight we're going to do a character study on King Saul. At this point in history, the children of Israel have decided that they do not want things to stay the way they are. They want Samuel to find them an earthly king like their neighbors all around them, and Josh is going to cover this. And God tells Samuel that they're not rejecting you, Samuel, they're rejecting me. Samuel forewarned the people as God had instructed him in 1 Samuel 8, verses 10 through 17. Nathan read that to us the other night. So enters into the picture Saul, or what will be King Saul. So who was King Saul? In 1 Samuel chapter 9, I guess you could turn there because we're just going to run there from kind of in order from there. 1 Samuel chapter 9 introduces Saul. At this point, Saul is still living and working in his father's household. Saul was the son of Kish, a Benjamite, from, as Saul says, the smallest tribes of Israel, and the least of those clans. Physically, Saul was a handsome young man, as could be found, more handsome than anyone that could be found in Israel. He was a head taller than anyone else. And I understand that, well, being short. But there was a whole lot of me, and there was somebody taller than him. But that was kind of how it was. In 1 Samuel 9, Saul is on a search for missing donkeys. That's where, I guess you'd say, the story starts. So we know that he's a responsible young man that's doing what his dad asked. I'm trying to find good qualities in this guy, okay? Just a few. But he's doing what his dad told him to do. He's going to find some donkeys. And he's pretty adamant about finding them. But along the way, Saul encountered the prophet who had been sent to him. Samuel and him ate together the next day. He told him that he was going to be king and anointed him with oil. Samuel instructed Saul to leave that town and to join up with a group of prophets in Gibeah for a time of worship. There Saul was touched by God's Spirit and prophesied with them. He then returned home to wait for him. 7 days later, Samuel gathered the nation of Mizpah. He announced that according to their demands, God would be giving them a king. He singled out the tribe of Benjamin, then the clan of Kish, then Saul individually as the chosen king. And I guess this is probably one of the most interesting parts to me, because he goes through this and he says that, it's the tribe of Benjamin, it's from the house of Kish, and it's Saul. And they go, well, where's Saul? He's hiding. The guy's hiding. But I mean, wouldn't a lot of us be hiding? Going to be the first king over all these people? What do you know of being a king? But Saul was hiding. They could not find him. He tried to hide among the nearby supplies, but God revealed him, and the young man was presented to the assembly. Saul quickly became a leader, rescuing men at Jabesh and Gilead, and called the people to worship the Lord for their success. He was then confirmed as king in his home of Gilgal. The reign of King Saul lasted 40 years according to the book of Acts 13 and 21. I really had trouble finding an exact date, to be frank about it. Different Bible versions have different time frames. That's something that I was running into, and I found a bunch of different answers, but Acts 13 and 21 answers it in my book. So Saul was a good military leader. Most people are a good military leader when God's on their side. Saul was. Much of that time, Israel was at war with countries including Philistia, Moab, Edom, and Amalek. Saul and his son Jonathan waged many successful campaigns with a volunteer army against each of these foes. But as we go through this, we wonder, was Saul faithful at first and then deteriorated as time went on, as maybe power grew? Or was he just faithless all the way around? And as I read, I really don't know how to answer that question. I guess I would lean towards faithful at first. I kind of look at Saul. Well, he was probably a good old boy. It's kind of the way that I look at him. He's a good old boy. But as Saul's story progresses, the mistakes that he makes get bigger and bigger and bigger. and the stakes get higher and higher. But somehow he's never able to own up to what is wrong. He never owns up to his mistakes, even when it's pointed out to him. For example, in 1 Samuel 13, he was told to wait for Samuel before offering sacrifices to God and initiating a battle with the Philistines. He didn't listen. Instead, he bulldozed ahead impatiently, even though Saul eventually wins the battle. He did it on his own terms instead of on God's, a point that he seems to never grasp. And I understand the attitude of just bulldozing ahead. I am not the greatest person to wait for anything. I like to get it done. So maybe that's a problem that I might have too. But Saul just bulldozed ahead. His self-ignorance is even greater in Samuel 15, where God commands Saul to go and fight against the Amalekites. And this is a story we've heard several times, but Saul was told, you go in there and you completely annihilate these people. Nothing left. I want it all dead. That's a pretty easy, simple command to me. But Saul, of course, didn't listen. He spared Agag. He was given clear instructions to thoroughly defeat the Amalekites. However, Saul stopped short and allowed the soldiers to plunder the spoil, even though he was explicitly told not to let this happen. And when Samuel confronts him, Saul somewhat confesses, but he does it with a spin. At least that's what I've heard it called, a spin. And he admits to it, but in a way he doesn't. He said the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to make a sacrifice to Yahweh. He justifies his stubbornness as a form of obedience, but he can't see what he's doing. Maybe he was just dull-witted, I don't know. But Samuel then calls Saul to account. Why then did you not listen to the voice of the Lord? And why did you rush upon the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord? So these are things that kind of outline the kind of king that Saul was. And we wonder what happened to Saul along the way. You know, Saul's acts of disobedience caused the Lord to take away his kingship. Samuel told him that because of his foolish choices, Saul would be replaced on the throne, and his final days were filled with an obsessive hunt for David, as well as other manic, destructive behaviors. As the Philistines mounted new attacks on the nation, Saul desperately ordered a diviner to call up the ghost of Samuel, to go as far as you're being the first king of Israel, a servant of the Lord, and then you go to a diviner to call up Samuel. And Saul was told that the Israelite army would be defeated the next day. The words of Samuel came to pass, and Saul and his son Jonathan were both killed during the battle. Saul ended up running himself through. You know, we're also going to do a study of David in this period. And Saul and David I'd like to contrast them a little bit. They're polar opposites. They're completely two different men. Saul's inadequacies make David shine really bright whenever we start reading about him. A man, a good leader. Saul's authority over Israel stayed mostly in the military realm. He spent a little time in internal affairs. He was not engaged in matters of faith. In fact, Saul showed disobedience toward God publicly in at least two instances, which we've already outlined, with destroying the Amalekites and offering burnt offerings. And these wrong decisions led to a fracture in Saul's relationship with the Lord, and it also led to a fracture in the relationship with him and Samuel, because Samuel's the messenger here. As time went on, the division led the king to bouts of depression. Music seemed to soothe him, and David was brought into the court because he could play the lute and sing songs that would soothe Saul. And David became a trusted member of Saul's court and later served in his army. As David grew in status, the king became jealous, which is another one of the faults of King Saul. When the young man's fame started to overshadow his own, instead of being humble and seeking God's help to overcome these strong emotions, he indulged and he tried to kill David at every opportunity that he could. And what's interesting is David had several opportunities to kill Saul, but never acted upon that because he saw that as that's God's place to take care of this man. Saul even tried to turn his own son and daughter against David, and that failed. Eventually, he waged an all-out attempt on David's life, chasing him to the borders of Israel. So I believe there's 4 lessons that we can learn from the rise and fall of King Saul. And the account of King Saul it's a troubling section of Scripture. I mean, anytime you have somebody that's just on a downward spiral, that's not fun to watch. It's not. It's not even fun to read about. But it does hold some important lessons about the level of faithfulness God expects from his people. So number 1, God judges us by our hearts, not by our outward appearance. You can be as pretty as you want, as tall as you want, as strong as you want, but God doesn't care about that. He doesn't care about your outward appearance. The Lord does not look at things the way that people look at them. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. The Israelites wanted a man for a king, and Saul certainly looked that part. He was physically strong, he was handsome. In time, however, his faulty inner thoughts and attitudes began to show on the outside as well. And God wasn't surprised, though, because he had a replacement in mind with King David. And the children of Israel, whenever you look at this, they kind of got what they signed up for in King Saul. Secondly, God wants us to have confidence in him. Confidence in him and not pride in ourselves. In James chapter 4, verse 6, the Bible tells us God resists or opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. And Saul let his position as king fill him up with an inflated sense of self-importance. Sometimes we all get there too. There are times in our life where we're doing really well, and we look about and think, boy, I've done good for myself. But somebody lets you wake up in the morning, every day. Somebody provided for you your abilities. You might do better at honing in on them than other people, but somebody provided you that. Eventually, Saul even assumed that he was qualified to take on the duties meant for the priest when he offered up offerings instead of waiting on Samuel in that particular event. The Lord saw each step that Saul made, and he rebuked him through Samuel. The third thing is God calls us to follow his will and not our own. In 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, this is David providing Solomon advice. And I know what you're thinking, well, that's kind of down the road a little bit. But David is providing Solomon advice, but this advice is no different than what the children of Israel have received the whole time. Yeah, he's talking to his son, but he tells him, I go the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and prove yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, and is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do, wherever you turn. We've heard that from the beginning, haven't we? When we obey God, when Israel obeyed God, they did very well. But whenever they disobeyed God, he punished them. Though Saul was chosen to be the Israelites' first earthly king, the Lord was still the highest authority for the nation. He expected Saul to be the model of godly submission and obedience. Okay, number 4. God calls us to follow his commands faithfully and not selectively. And I know that this was a long time ago, but we kind of do this now, don't we? There's things that we don't mind doing, but there's things that we don't like doing. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 1 and 2, the Bible says, Now it shall come to pass, if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully, I want to underline that word carefully, all his commandments which I command you today, that the Lord your God will set you high above all nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, because you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Saul was blessed with gifts such as confidence and passion. He had a go-getter attitude, but pride, insecurity, and impatience in certain moments led him to disregard what he knew what was right, and to try and defend. And he then tried to defend himself instead of just saying, "Hey, I'm wrong." Because his heart was not fully given to God, he lost his position, he lost his favor. And the story of King Saul is really a cautionary tale that applies to every believer, since we all have an influence on those around us. His kingship reminds us that the best earthly leaders aren't meant to take the place of God, but they're to point people to the Lord by the actions that they take. And closing remarks, what are some things we can learn from the life of Saul? And this is good or bad. Saul's failures hit closer to home than we might dare to admit. I believe he started out as an honest, good old boy. He was a hardworking guy. He did not believe that he was fit for the position of a king. I think that's kind of shown whenever he was hiding. But along the way, Saul valued the opinion of the people over God's wisdom. He feared people when he should have feared God. He continued to worry about one thing in light of correction: his own reputation and his own honor. And Saul is perpetually downplaying his role in the bad decisions that he makes. He keeps bringing in other people as if they are responsible for his mistakes. And that's something I believe that we can learn. Just if you did it, take ownership, good or bad. Hey, I did it. Let's move on from there. The remainder of 1 Samuel recounts Saul's further slide into moral and spiritual decay. His descent provides a strong contrast with David's rise to a role of influence. At the end of the day, Saul placed his real trust in himself, in his plan, and others' opinions of him. When convicted of this sin, his response is less than admirable. He never actually changes. He maintains these behaviors until the end as he continues down a self-centered and prideful path. Contrast this with David, who is characterized in these same chapters as radically obedient and trusting Yahweh, which eventually leads to his rise as king, and it solidifies his lineage. These two characters provide us an opportunity for self-reflection so that we might find the blind spots that we might have in our lives. You know, some people have the blind spot of pride. It might be getting in our way. Sometimes we justify our poor decisions and we try to negotiate with God or maybe explain this away. We're similar to Saul. We're more similar to Saul, or I am more similar to Saul than different. In what ways do we elevate the opinions of other people above the wisdom of God? That happens. In what ways do we blame shift in order to avoid truly owning our failures, whatever they might be? Saul's demise is a tragic story, but it's a powerful lesson. It's a warning for us so we don't repeat his mistakes. That's why there's history, folks. We read history so we don't do the things that they did over and over and over again. But our deepest character flaws don't have to define us. We all have flaws. We all have problems. We all have issues. We're all broken in some way. But that don't have to define us. We can be better tomorrow than we were today. What Saul needed and what we really need are new hearts and new minds that don't defend ourselves and justify our failures and our selfishness. What we need is what David later prays for after his greatest blunder in Psalms 51 and 10. David says, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." And I think that's the contrast between Saul and David right there. David was a man who, whenever he made a fault and you pointed that out, he would correct it. And he wanted to correct it whenever Saul would just explain it away. That's all I have this evening. Hope something was useful to you. Maybe prompt more study on your behalf. We never close the service without offering an invitation. If you've never obeyed the gospel, we give you that opportunity. If you have obeyed the gospel and maybe you're struggling with something and need the prayers of the church, we can pray with you, pray for you. Please come as we stand and as we sing.
Thanks for watching this video. I know what you're thinking. I don't want to miss another video from this channel. In order to avoid that, click on the red button down there, subscribe, and then click the bell icon. Not only will that alert you each time a new video is uploaded to the channel, it will also help spread the channel to other people's awareness. So, go ahead, do it. Like right now, click on it.